Hello?
Hey, Rich, it's Larson. You got a minute?
Sure, Larson. What's up?
Okay, well, welcome to the Got a Minute podcast. This is Larson Hicks, and I'm here with Pastor Rich Lusk. How you doing, sir?
Pretty good. How about you, Larson?
I'm good. I apologize for the fact that I haven't shaved here. I've been at the beach over the weekend with the family and got in late, so I'm a little scruffy, but rejuvenated from my time off. And I understand you just got home from marriage recently.
That is right. My son just got married, so we were excited about that, and that weekend went well. So it's really good. You know, Larson, I'm wondering if we should rename this podcast from Got a Minute to something like Off the Cuff.
There you go.
That's kind of how we operate here.
Got an hour.
I hear other people when they're doing podcasts, they'll refer to their notes and whatnot, and you and I just kind of turn on our computer and start recording, and then decide what we're going to talk about. It's kind of how it goes.
I think it's the best way. I think that captures the spirit of really what I was hoping we would do with this podcast, which is capture sort of these spontaneous conversations that you and I tend to have. That I think are I think it's us at our best. Is when you and I are kind of just freewheeling, kind of diving into a topic.
Well, speaking of diving into a topic, let's do it.
Yeah, so I wanted to talk about dating and marriage, which, I told my wife just a few minutes ago, hey, I think I'm going to talk about dating and marriage with Rich. And she goes, oh, boy, here we go again. And she rolled her eyes because this is such a hot topic in my home. I've got 3 teenage boys, and, we're in a church full of young people that are all kind of right in that age range. And so, this whole topic of dating versus courtship, what does this all mean? It's very, very, it's a very hot topic. I don't know that it will not be as long as we've got young people in our midst. And so, I think the part of it that's maybe difficult or controversial in our circles is the word courtship, gained so much prominence with the book. I think I Kiss Dating Goodbye was kind of the beginning, maybe. And I know Doug Wilson's written stuff on the topic, and I feel like just that the terminology courtship really got a lot ahead of steam. And it's kind of like when people say, well, I go to a church where they have expositional teaching. It's like kind of a buzzword to sort of indicate that you're hardcore and you're really serious about doing the right thing. But the application I see is kind of all over the map. So for starters, Rich, what in your mind, what's the difference between dating and courtship, or is there a difference?
Well, yeah, these terms can be used to refer to a lot of different things, and obviously a lot of those things are, it varies from culture to culture, and from time to time. What these terms mean and how people go about seeking a spouse. It's interesting that you mentioned the Josh Harris book, I Kissed Dating Goodbye. Of course, we know what happened with him, but
yeah.
And his sad slide into apostasy. It's interesting for me because I got married, basically the week I graduated college. In 1995, and we started our life together right out of college, and so we had what you could call a cornerstone marriage, where you start out basically with nothing and build a life together, and then we had kids, and then and somewhere in that intervening time, I don't know exactly when Josh Harris's book was published. But I know purity culture, kind of became a big thing with the purity balls and, pledges and whatnot.
Yeah.
Probably well-intentioned, but, really kind of cheesy, corny, and probably also very badly misguided in some cases. By the time my kids were into their teen years, I think purity culture had kind of come and gone, or at least we were not in churches or circles where that was a thing. So we kind of dodged that bullet. But I do think it's important to recognize that purity culture was trying to address the whole purity movement or I Kiss Dating Goodbye movement was trying to address a very real problem of
Sure.
sexual sin among Christian young people,
Sure.
and attempt to do something about that, and that's certainly a good thing. What the Bible teaches about sex and about sexual sin, sexual temptation, is something that we need to be teaching our kids from a very early age, so they will understand that sex is reserved for marriage. That's God's beautiful design. There are good and wise reasons for that. And all kinds of bad things happen when you don't adhere to God's design, when you violate God's law in this area. So I would say that there are extremes. I don't know exactly how those terms, dating and courtship, should be defined in our day, because I think, again, they can mean a lot of different things. But I think that there are certain parameters, or there are certain principles. Scripture gives us wisdom in this area. It does not give us a formula or a set of techniques. And I think that the wisdom that God gives to us, I think the principles that you could say God's word gives to us could play out in a system that you might call courtship, or could play out in a system that you could call Christian dating. I don't think it has to necessarily be one or the other, because I think there's not just one right way to approach the whole question of how do I find a spouse, or if you're a parent, how do I help my kids find a spouse? Right. So that's one thing I would definitely, so on the one hand, Christians definitely want to avoid the wreckage of the sexual revolution and all that has come with that. Right. That's obviously been a disaster. We want to avoid that. On the other hand, I think we want to avoid some kind of overly rigid set of techniques or a very specific formula that somebody might act like comes straight out of Scripture, when really it right. doesn't. So I think those would be extremes that we want to avoid.
Yeah, and the sexual revolution, avoiding that purity culture. I think you're right. All that's good and well intentioned. I think where we start getting into the murky waters here is when you start talking about, okay, so we're all saying we need to avoid premarital sex. Great, got it. But now what? And I think the idea of guarding your heart, protecting a woman's heart in particular, treating your sisters in Christ as or young women and in the church as sisters with all purity. What does that look like, especially if you're intending to try to find a wife? You mentioned the idea that this gets off the rails when you start getting into a step-by-step process. You use the term Christian dating, which I'm sure there were some gasps from people listening. I'm sure there were some gasps in the room, like those two words should never go together, Christian and dating. But is there a step-by-step process, or is there a model? Are there principles here that we can start to apply, and where do things get? Where is there liberty here? How much liberty is there?
Yeah, that's good. So one distinction to make that some people would make between dating and courtship is that courtship has parental supervision, dating does not. So dating, just the two young people go off on their own and figure things out on their own, and they're not accountable to anybody. Nobody's giving any insight or input. And then the courtship process, you have parents on both sides, the parents of the young man, the parents of the young woman, who are heavily involved in the process. I actually, so when I mention Christian dating, what I have in mind is obviously Christian sexual ethics being adhered to, God's design for marriage being respected, all of that. But also, I think it would be a system, if you will, where parents do provide oversight and input. But I think what's happened in some circles where courtship is really pushed is it's not just that you have parental involvement. It's not just that you have parental oversight. It's that you have overbearing parents who, it's basically overkill. They're too involved. And so just as with so many other things when it comes to parenting, there's a sense in which the your goal as a parent, of course, is to work yourself out of a job. And that means that as your kids grow up, if you have done your job well, you will be giving your kids a longer and longer leash until you finally unleash them altogether. Obviously, that's the whole point, is to launch your kids out into the world where they can be faithful Christians living in the world and go on to continue building the kingdom of God and carrying on your legacy of faith and whatnot on their own.
Right.
That's what you're aiming at. And I would say that, I love what Doug Wilson said somewhere. I don't know if this was in print or just something that he's kind of those off the cuff comments that he's made before. But he said the difference between dating and courtship is that in dating you have 2 idiots involved. In courtship you have 6 idiots involved. So you got the guy and the girl, right, and you got both sets of parents. And so you've kind of multiplied the idiocy. Well, I've seen that play out before, where you've got parents who just, they actually, make all kinds of mistakes and actually make things far worse for their kids. And in some cases, maybe even set the bar so high, or they made things so difficult that, say a daughter doesn't end up getting married at all because the bar has been set so high that any potential suitor who might come along has got to jump through so many hoops just to be able to spend any time with the girl that, it's such a barrier to entry that she never even really gets that opportunity. So again, there are a range of views and practices here. On the other hand, I have seen people who do what they would call courtship do it well, so it can be done well. I just refer to Christian dating because I think that kind of strikes the best balance to me of the different things that are out there. I had 2 kids get married this summer, and that's what we did with them. So I can say, it does work if you give it a chance. But again, it does take some wisdom. It takes training, in terms of how you raise your children. There's a lot of training that goes into it. So just to give you an example, let me make one more distinction here that I think will be helpful for us. I think you also have to distinguish a date as an event from dating as a relationship. We all know that somebody can go on a date. It doesn't automatically make them boyfriend, girlfriend. And then there's dating as a relationship, where obviously that's a more serious thing. Our rule of thumb with our kids, and all my kids are out of high school now, but my rule of thumb with our kids was, you can go on a date as an event, like say if the school has a dance and you can take a date to that. That's fine. You can do a date as an event, but no serious dating relationship while you're in high school. And the reason for that is that, we believed that a dating relationship ought to be intentional and aimed towards marriage. And so, if the earliest time that you could marry somebody would be 6 years away, do you really want to date for the next 6 years? That doesn't make a lot of sense. And that's kind of, that's going to, dangle a lot of temptation right in front of you. And that's just going to create probably a lot of problems. More problems than it's worth. So we put off dating through high school. Although we did allow our kids to go on dates as events, we put off the boyfriend girlfriend, and that's just parents, I think, being appropriately protective, appropriately wise. Now, if getting married at age 18 is a real possibility for you, then maybe, dating in high school is not such a bad thing towards the end of high school, So again, it kind of depends on what you think the marriageable age is going to be for you, which, for a man is going to depend to some degree on what kind of career he pursues, what kind of training he's going to need for that career when he becomes financially viable and can support himself, all of that. So those are things to take into account. And even there's a few caveats you could make, but that's how I would look at it. So dating ought to be purposeful and directed towards marriage. It ought to be intentional in that kind of way. And I would say that if you're in a boyfriend-girlfriend relationship and you come to the realization that you're definitely not going to marry this person, then you should break that off as quickly as possible to save both of you any additional heartache. On the other hand, saying that dating is intentional and purposeful doesn't mean that it should be, all business and no enjoyment. Because I think there's some people who kind of, they swing to that extreme. Or, they kind of turn it into then just this elaborate job interview kind of thing. And certainly in one sense, you are interviewing for a job when you're dating. You're interviewing for the job of a husband or a wife. Yeah. But, it ought to be enjoyable. And I think that there are different, ways in which our roles as men and women come into play in dating, and I think that's really important too. Where the man takes the lead. Typically, I think it ought to be a man who's asking a girl out on a date.
Right.
So one thing that I did, and this is also, this is another thing that might be a little bit different, between what I've called Christian dating versus courtship. I told my girls a lot of things, of course, as they were growing up. But one thing I said is, I will never run off a good man. Okay. So the whole idea of dad, meeting a guy and he's cleaning his shotgun while they have their little pre-date talk. So I'm not going to do that. I don't want to scare off a good man. So you don't have to worry about that. I want to help you make a good decision. I want to help you be wise, but I'm not going to scare off a good man. But I also said, I trust you to make a good judgment on the front end. So if a guy asks you out, you are certainly free to say no if you know you're not interested. Don't worry about being nice. Be truthful. But if you are interested and you're going to go on a date, he doesn't have to talk to me to take you on one date. But if there's going to be multiple dates and this thing starts getting serious, then you need to get parental input very early on, once something starts to develop.
That's good. I think those are fantastic principles, and I think that's really helpful. I mean, you gave some specifics there, which I know is becomes dangerous, when you start giving specifics, because people really cling to specifics. We all want a paint by numbers kit, how to. But I think just to kind of review, I mean, the principles that you're pointing to are daughters and sons are different, right? So we actually treat them differently. So, a young man is supposed to leave and cleave. So the idea, and I've told my boys this, I've told other parents in our church this, I don't really want to have a lot to do with my son's, efforts to find a wife. Like that's his job. That's his calling. That's his work. He's got to be motivated and he's got to go out and find that woman. I want to be his advisor. I want to be I hope that I've positioned myself in such a way that he seeks me for wisdom. But the relationship, the oversight that I'm providing to a son who's left the home and is pursuing a girl is pretty minimal. You're right. In the home, while you're in high school, we're not going to be in a dating relationship. To me, that's wise for the exact same reason you gave. And we haven't used this term yet, but the idea of recreational dating. And I grew up in a culture that was all about recreational dating. You have a boyfriend and a girlfriend, you break up, you get another boyfriend, you get another girlfriend, whatever, and it's kind of this part of life that you don't have a boyfriend, you don't have a girlfriend. What's wrong with you? That's what you're supposed to do. So we're rejecting all of that absolutely as foolish, unhelpful, unwise. But a young man leaving and cleaving, the fact that boys, your relationship with your sons is different. But I think you made a really great point about daughters that yes, ultimately, courtship, without a doubt, is something that is designed to protect, especially women, from being taken advantage of, being emotionally manipulated by men who have bad intentions. But the best protection you can provide a daughter is excellent training, excellent discernment.
Exactly. That's really what I'm getting at. So, yeah, you're right. I mean, as a father, you have a responsibility to protect your daughter. But it is possible to be overprotective and actually smother her,
Right.
So yeah, I mean, there's a very delicate balance there that you want to seek as a father, where you're giving oversight and protection, but you're not being overbearing. And again, it goes back to the training you did from their earliest days. You want to raise up a child you can trust. If you have not done that, and then your daughter gets to be 18, well, the reality is at that point, in a lot of ways, you're kind of behind the eight ball. It's going to be very, very hard to play catch up. And not only raising a daughter that you can trust to make good decisions, but also so that she trusts you, so that she trusts her mom and her dad
That's right.
to give her good and wise insight. So that as well. So it's really both and yeah, that's really crucial. It's interesting to think back to like how my parents grew up. Say in the 50s and 60s, kind of that whole generation. And it's interesting because you might even say they practiced a kind of recreational dating that was, I mean, obviously people are always sinners, so sexual sin is always going to be an issue. But they practiced a kind of recreational dating that in some ways had some benefits in the sense that, like, the way I've heard it described is, you could go out on a date with one person on a Friday night and another person a Saturday night. There was no expectation, generally speaking, of sexual activity. So there, there were all kinds of boundaries up. Everybody sort of knew each other, but it was a way for you to get to know somebody of the opposite spouse, get comfortable being around somebody of the opposite spouse, of the opposite sex. I said opposite spouse, opposite sex. That kind of thing, and you would get that experience in a kind of healthy way. And I think there was something useful about that, because one thing that I've seen in some Christian circles, and particularly in places where courtship is really, really stressed, sometimes there's this, if you're going to get to know somebody of the opposite sex, it's like, how do you do that?
Right.
And it's, and it may be in a large group, and that's fine. You can get to know people. And I actually think there's a lot, this is something we come back to. I think there's a lot to be said for, getting to know somebody of the opposite sex in a larger group setting. There's a lot of value in that. But what I've seen happen sometimes is that if you in a courtship model take a girl, finally get to the point where you're taking a girl out to do something, it's like everybody already assumes that you're practically married because you've had to jump through so many hoops just to get to that point. And so it ratchets up the intensity of even just an initial relationship that actually I think it makes it almost too difficult in a way for guys and girls to pair off. And you don't want that. So making it too easy, making it too hard, there are extremes on both sides. So again, I think it's wisdom that threads that needle.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point to kind of jump up and down on a little bit really quickly I totally agree. This is the place where this becomes, I think, really dangerous and unhelpful, is for a boy to be able to, and one of the things, okay, a couple things. One is you talked about this kind of 50s era sort of model where you're taking, girls and boys are going out on dates. Boys are taking girls out on dates. Let's go get a milkshake. Let's go get, a burger, whatever. Let's go to the dance. And there's not a ton of pressure there. It's not, and there's also not an expectation that we are a thing now. Like we're a thing now because we went on a date. Obviously, if that happens over and over with the same girl, then it's like, okay, something's happening here, something's changed in this dynamic. But one of the things I think we're missing in that model that was really, really good was young men learning how to take initiative to pursue a woman.
Yes.
Right?
Yes, that is exactly right.
Which is something that if you're going to be a good husband, if you're going to be a romantic husband, if you're going to be a husband that meets his wife's needs, you're going to have to learn how to pursue, how to take initiative. If you're going to have a sexually fulfilling marriage, you're going to have to learn as a man how to take initiative. And if you think that, this is about filling out an application, that this is the initiative of applying for college or something, it's a different animal altogether. And I also think, so the second piece, Rich, that you mentioned, is just the pressure and the intensity of courtship. It's somehow this courtship model has gotten to a point to where the thought is that a girl who has no relationship whatsoever with a young man can have that young man go to the father and ask for permission to court her, and that be granted, and without her being involved in any sort of way. In my mind, I mean, I'm just thinking about my own daughters, and you can probably speak to this. My daughters are very young, so I've got a long way to go before this happens. But in my mind, there's already a cordial relationship there between the guy and the girl. They've gotten to know each other in group settings. He's maybe taken her out to get some coffee, and there's clearly chemistry. And he's going to the dad saying, "I think your daughter and I have real chemistry here. I'd like to pursue. I like to take I like to pursue this further and get to know her more, and continue to take her out on dates. When it's becoming a thing, it's becoming a relationship." That's when you're getting dad involved and saying, "Hey, I don't want to steal your daughter's heart without you having any knowledge of what's going on."
Right. Yes. Yes. So sons, young men learning how to pursue a woman, women having the experience of being pursued and what that means. Yeah, I think that's really, really good. Provided again, you've got all the right guardrails in place. So I think that's really, really helpful. And again, a lot of this also goes back, as we've talked about, training you do long before your kids get to dating age, so that they're disciplined, so they have, some measure of wisdom of their own, and they know what to look for. I mean, so, for example, they know they should only date, not just another believer, I would say, but a mature, growing Christian. Right. Someone whose faith is very evident, not just somebody who says they're a Christian and could check that box on a census form, but somebody who actually shows evidence of being a faithful believer, so that they recognize that. Yeah, I think that's really, really good. I think another thing just to recognize, and this goes back to what something we started with, the wreckage of the sexual revolution, is that basically dating is dead at this point. Outside of Christian circles where there's some, where people are much more traditionally minded, dating is largely dead. You have hookup culture that's totally taken its place, where it's all about a casual sexual relationship. Right. So in a lot of ways, Christians are about the only people left who are dating, or who are looking for pathways into marriage, with collapsing marriage rates and with so much sexual promiscuity. I think this is a real issue. And again, I would say for Christians, carrying on, common sense, wise dating practices is something that we should be very supportive of, because obviously we do want our kids to get married. And I think that there are a lot of advantages with getting married, relatively early, say as opposed to now where the average age of marriage is climbing up close to 30. I know there's not any magical age at which people should be getting married, but if you're talking about getting the average age being, getting close to 30, that's a lot of years of having to deal with sexual temptation. It means that a woman is going to have lost some of her best years of fertility and those kinds of things. I think also along with all of this, and I said, obviously, training your kids and knowing what to look for in a spouse, that it's got to be a faithful and growing Christian and that kind of thing. But I think just in general, understanding something about the opposite sex, understanding what the opposite sex values, in a spouse, I think that kind of thing is really, really important. So I gave my kids a little grid, or tried to, at least. I mean, this is what we were hoping to communicate to them. And when I've taught on this, I've done the same kind of thing. But I would always say, okay, the most important thing is, what is their faith like? Do they have mature and growing, vibrant Christian character? Physical attraction obviously is important. That's got to be there as well. There's got to be physical attraction. That's going to be more important for a man towards a woman than a woman towards a man, because just of how men, what men value in women certainly includes their physical beauty. That's how God has made them.
Yep.
I would say masculinity and femininity, understanding what masculinity and femininity are, understanding how the masculine is drawn to the feminine and the feminine to the masculine. So understanding that. And there are little things that happen in a dating relationship where these kind of things come out. So, a lot of our sort of, I know chivalry can be attacked in various ways or criticized in various ways, but I think a lot of our chivalrous customs are just ways of communicating masculinity and femininity. So if a man opens a car door or a building door for a woman, that's a way of communicating, strength, protection, provision. A man paying on a date, that's a way of communicating strength and provision, things like that. So they, they're not empty customs. They actually do have value in what they signal.
Yep.
That may just be a surface level kind of thing, but I think it points to something much deeper, and you got to make sure that the deeper reality is there. But, and of course, today you have a lot of women who'd be very offended at the thought that a man might open her door or pay for her meal, that kind of thing. And then personality, there's got to be some kind of chemistry. Can he make her laugh? Does he enjoy being, in her company and all of that? So there's got to be some kind of personality chemistry as well. So Christian faith, a growing, vibrant faith, physical attraction, masculinity, femininity, personality. Those are the main things that I think you're looking for if you're kind of thinking of a grid of like, how do I evaluate this person? How do I vet this person as a potential spouse?
Yeah. I think something you touched on there, Rich, that we should dive a little deeper into is, and we've already alluded to this, but this temptation, I think that in the kind of courtship model, in the circles where courtship is something that we value, or at least this biblical concept of Christian dating is something we value. It means kind of more protection from mom and dad over particularly the daughter. But the danger, the ditch that I've certainly seen, I know you have as well, is the ditch of setting far too high a bar.
Yes.
So that the daughter is ends up, no man is good enough for her because dad is involved now, and his standards are so high, and you've got these beautiful, marriageable young ladies who are sitting on the shelf, and all the good men are getting married off younger while they're waiting for the perfect man.
Yeah, that is so true. Sometimes guys can have very unrealistic expectations about female beauty, appearance, all of that. So again, you have to be realistic. But the same thing can happen on the other side, and actually parents can, in a misguided way, encourage unrealistic expectations and set the bar so high that, whether it's the kind of job or the amount of money a man has to have, or whatever else it might be, that basically makes the young woman almost unmarriageable. So I've seen that happen as well. I'll tell you another thing where that you have to be aware of in today's world is that just the way that people talk about the dating market and that kind of thing, which, I don't really care for the word market in this context because it makes it sound like we're buying and selling, which we're clearly not. Right. But that's how people talk about it. But with things like online dating apps, and I'm not saying it's wrong to use, those kinds of tools, or just social media in general, the pool of people that you are now being compared to is so much larger. And this can be one of those things that creates very unrealistic expectations for men and for women. So think about this, a few generations ago, growing up in a small town, where you're going to marry somebody else who grew up in this same small town. And so the pool that you're going to pull from to find a spouse is pretty small, generally speaking. And so, if you think of it as a kind of competition, again, I don't like to use that word either, but you get what I mean by that. It's a pretty small group. As the people who are growing up together sort of sort themselves out and pair up, that kind of thing. Well, now you're in competition with thousands upon thousands, if not millions of people on this sort of global, date, on these apps where people from all over the world can set up a profile. Of course, a lot of the profiles even can be fake. Or just, social media in general does this. So so I think what I'm getting at is it makes it much easier for people to be discontent. Right. It makes it much easier for people to become way too picky and then feel like they have to settle. Right. Okay. When in reality, you might not be settling at all. You might be ending up with somebody who's actually a good match, but you're discontent because you have seen, for a guy, it might be that you saw so many women on Instagram or on a dating app, they're just more attractive than the woman you're marrying. Right. Well, that's ridiculous. I mean, you just have to be realistic about that kind of thing. Or, a woman who's, women are, the term that's used is hypergamy. Women want to marry up,
Yeah.
so they generally want to marry somebody who's taller, better educated, wealthier, higher status, what have you. And this has to do with just, the role of the man and the woman in the relationship and that kind of thing. Even women who claim to be feminists still have very strong hypergamous tendencies. It's just built into, into the way things are. But it's possible for hypergamy to just go haywire and for women to have completely unrealistic expectations about the kind of man they should be able to find. And this really happens with hookup culture because, when God's standards for sex are not observed, and so, whether it's in high school or college campus or wherever, and a woman sleeps around, she might sleep with a lot of guys who would never consider marrying her.
Right.
They used her for sex, but then she thinks, oh, well, that guy was super attractive and high status and whatnot, so surely that's the kind of guy who would want to marry me.
Right.
Well, no, that just because that guy slept with you doesn't mean that a guy like that would want to marry you. So it throws people's expectations way out of whack, completely out of alignment with reality. So again, what is the biblical wisdom? What are the biblical principles here? Parents need to be involved as overseers, advisors, protectors, and how you play that role is different for a son than it is for a daughter. I think it's Doug Wilson who used the analogy of an away game versus a home game. I like that. With a son, you're playing an away game. With a daughter, it's a home game. You're kind of on your home turf, and you are going to be giving a little bit more oversight in certain kinds of concrete, tangible ways. But still, raise kids you can trust. Raise your kids in such a way that they will trust you, trust your judgment, know you have their best interests in view so that your counsel will be heard. And then obviously have accountability, have guardrails up so that you don't put yourself in overly tempting situations. Date purposefully, intentionally with a view to marriage, and as you seek to vet somebody, that's where parental counsel and insight is very, very helpful, but also be realistic and be wise in the decisions you make, along those lines.
Yeah, and just to kind of add to the conversation about the daughter and about having too high a bar, I will say, and this is easy for me to say as a father who doesn't have any daughters old enough to get married or to really even be in that phase. So I'm kind of giving myself a pep talk here, but I do believe that finding a husband or the Lord, bringing a husband to your daughter ultimately requires faith, and it requires and wisdom, obviously. And I think the wisdom to me is one of the things, you and I have talked a lot about Greg Krebel, I don't know how you pronounce it, Krebiel, however you pronounce it. His book, Eggs Are Expensive, Sperm is Cheap. And he makes a point in that book that I think is very true. And that is that, again, we don't like this metaphor, but it's helpful to be frank and to look at things from this perspective. In the sexual marketplace, women ages 18 to 25 are at the absolute peak. They have the most buying power. Let's put it that way in the marketplace, right? In the sexual marketplace, they command the most value. And a way to think about that is when your daughters are in that age range, they are in the best position to attract the most high quality man available, because they in that age range, this is just hardwired into the way that men think about women, is that attractiveness and fertility and beauty and health and all of those things just factor much higher in a man's estimation of a woman. And so I think a wise father is looking at that kind of age range and is saying, this is we should be actively engaged in trying to help our daughter and not be, I think what happens with a lot of folks is that they're going, well, first she's got to finish college, and we're not even going to talk about marriage until then, and we're looking for a man who already has, an established career and income, or a bunch of college degrees or whatever. And I think that the reality is that there's a lot of faith involved here, and you're trying to catch a man on his way up, a young man who's on his way up. And I think that takes wisdom. Both dad and daughter, and wife obviously need to be looking with using some wisdom and also some faith in that whole process at that age. But I think that's kind of, if you're a parent of a daughter, I think that's going to be your window, your window of snagging probably the most, the highest potential husband material in that age. Not to say that you get past that and you lose all hope, but it's an opportunity that I think a wise woman and wise parents are going to want to take advantage of.
Well, and it's sometimes frowned upon in our day and age, but a woman of that age should be willing to consider a man who's a little bit older, even. But yeah, a couple things that you made me think of. One, yes, I would recommend that it's not a Christian book. Greg Kriebel's book, Eggs Are Expensive, Sperm is Cheap. That's a book that's well worth reading for men. It's just a heavy dose of reality. It's one of those, this is how God made the world, whether you like it or not, type books. Good for men to read, to make you a realist about things. I'd also say Aaron Renn's newsletter, maybe the first 30 or so issues of The Masculinist by Aaron Renn are very much worth reading. Michael Foster and Non-Tenant's book, It's Good to Be a Man, would be a good one for men to read. Those are some recommendations for young men. But yeah, I think you're exactly right. If you marry young, you are marrying for potential. Okay. Well, especially from the woman's perspective, because you're going to be marrying a man who probably has not accomplished very much yet.
Right.
You talked about catching a man on his way up. He's already got an established trajectory towards what he's doing, what he's going to do with his life. Man, I always go back to Genesis chapter 2. Genesis chapter 2, God gives the man a job before he gives him a wife. So the man's got a mission before he's got a wife. And of course, then he needs the wife, he needs the woman to help him fulfill his mission, but he's already got a mission. So for young men, it's mission before marriage. Figure out your mission, then you're ready to find a wife. And that doesn't mean your mission has to be set in stone or every detail has to be figured out. And you might still be in school if you're doing, if you're going to be a doctor or lawyer or some profession that requires a lot of training. I'm not saying you have to finish that before you get married. Obviously, my son's in med school right now and got married. I think that's perfectly fine. The trajectory, like where he's headed, is set. There's no question about that. But if a woman marries a man young, she's marrying for potential. Based on where she thinks he can go. And basically she's saying, I think you're going someplace good, someplace that I want to follow you there. Right. She sees potential to build a life together with this man because he's got direction. So that's the thing. If you're a young woman and you're looking at a young man and, he's in his early 20s and maybe doesn't have, hardly any money and that kind of thing, and is in the very beginning stages of his work, his career, you're saying, okay, does this guy have the work ethic? Does he have the skills he needs to move forward to advance so he can provide for a family? That's the kind of question you're asking. I just add this: when you marry, especially if you marry young, you're making a bet on each other.
Yeah.
And what I'm saying is make sure it's a safe bet, a wise bet based on the potential that you see there. So, you don't know the future, but you can see the direction someone is headed. And that's the main thing that you want to look for.
And I think such a phenomenal point. And the way you said it, young men, mission before marriage, that's kind of the orientation that young men should have. I think that's really, really important, and I don't think enough dads are pushing that. I think a lot of young men love the idea of early marriage. Obviously, they're at their kind of peak sexually, and they are very eager for marriage and for that opportunity, but the relationship thing can be potentially a big distraction for young men who are not thinking about this. And I think the way that you talked about for a father of a daughter, as he's evaluating and helping his daughter evaluate a potential, a suitor, let's say, I think it's important that we reject the emotionalism, romanticism that is so prevalent in popular culture of like, what does your heart tell you? All of that stuff. Like, are you meant for each other? Do you feel like you're meant for each other? And I think your point about, you can evaluate a young man who isn't established in his career by looking at his habits and his trajectory. And so I think about my own, my wife and I started dating in high school. We were very young. And she didn't have, a father who was very involved in that whole process. But, I was very interested in getting him involved. And when I was ready to pursue her for marriage in a serious way, I pursued his approval. And I think, I was a liberal arts student at the time. There was a phase where I thought I wanted to be a doctor. There was a phase where I thought I wanted to be a pastor. But I think the thing that was evident, to her dad was this guy has worked really hard, whether he was working at a fast food place and delivering papers on the side and selling knives on the side or whatever. Like this guy is not afraid to work hard. And B, he loves my daughter, and my daughter really loves him and really enjoys his company. And there's a real chemistry there. I think that's a pretty solid, whether or not the guy has started medical school or he's started engineering school or he's got a real obvious career path. I think you can potentially, if you're wise, you can discern the trajectory without those kinds of specific indicators.
Yeah. So, I think for young men, we've kind of established, it's mission before marriage. So at least figure out what it is you're going to want to do. Get on a track that's going somewhere, and then go pursue a woman. And again, how far you have to be down that track, that's going to vary from situation to situation. And like Larson, using yourself, obviously you went through several different iterations of thinking, this is what I want to be, or that's what I want to be. I'm not saying a man has to have everything, every last detail figured out, but he does need to be heading somewhere, and he needs to have demonstrated potential.
Yeah.
You talked about, for women, that age 18 to 25, range right there. That's when they're most attractive as a candidate for marriage. Doesn't mean that a woman who's past 25 is not going to get married, certainly, but the chances do start to go down some after that age.
Start to get,
the statistics do bear that out. So again, but so this is one thing I would say when it comes to raising daughters is a lot of parents today basically take an androgynous approach to parenting. And so they raise daughters the same way they raise sons. And I think that's a huge mistake. When you're raising a son, you're training a son primarily for dominion, so he can be a protector and a provider. When Adam is told to guard and cultivate the garden, that's really what that is about. Guarding obviously is protecting. He's got to protect the garden, which means protecting the woman in the garden because she's made in the garden. And then, cultivating the garden. That's so he can be a provider. Now, after the fall, we know thorns and thistles will get in the way of that work of providing. So it becomes much more difficult in a fallen world. But still, that's the man's fundamental responsibility. So, when you're evaluating a man, that's really, really important. Paul's getting at the same thing in Ephesians 5 when he talks about nurturing and cherishing a woman. A wife. Cherishing has to do with keeping warm. It has to do certainly with lavishing love on her, but it also has to do in a very practical kind of way with providing for her. and protecting her, bringing safety and shelter and those kinds of things into her life. So that's crucial for a man. But there's a lot. But like I said, parents today often take a very androgynous approach to their kids, and so they end up, they want to put their girls in all the same kind of sports activities as they do boys, not recognizing that, you're training a boy for dominion, and so sports are going to play a different role in a boy's life than a girl's life. I'm not saying girls can't play sports. I'm just saying sports have always played a different role for men than they have for women. Physical competitions and what else, it's got a different role in a man's life than a woman's life. There's a reason why virtually all games and sports throughout history have been invented by men, and not by, then there'll be a woman's version of it sometimes, but men are the ones who invent these things and develop these things because they play a very significant role for men, and turning boys into men, developing manhood. But if you raise a girl the same way you raise a boy, then what happens is that young woman is going to be very career minded. And what has happened with a lot of young women today is they know exactly what they want in terms of a career, and they're very career focused. And so you will often even hear today women talk about how they don't want to get married. They want to put off marriage because they want to build a career first. And I think I said for a man, it's mission before marriage. So he needs to figure out what his vocational trajectory is going to be before he goes and finds a spouse, because when he goes and he's trying to date a girl, pursue a girl for marriage, court a girl, whatever terminology you want to use, at some point she's probably going to encounter her father, who's going to say, "How are you going to provide for my daughter?" And that's really the question he's asking: is do you have a mission? And he's perfectly right to ask that question. That's a great question to ask a young man. But with a woman, it's different. We don't and should not be expecting women to be shouldering the primary burden of provision for a household. So what you're raising a girl to do is different. You're raising her to be a wife and a mother, which does not mean she should be left uneducated. I would say just the opposite. Her education is vital, but her education is going to serve a somewhat different purpose in her life. She needs to be growing in wisdom and all of that as well, but she doesn't need to be focused on a career in the way that a young man would be focused on developing a career. And actually, I would say for her, it ought to be, I would say again, as you described, a woman's prime years. That's when she needs to be focused on, okay, what can I do to best prepare myself to be a wife and a mother? And then down the line, after she's raised kids, if she wants to go develop a career, hey, that's great. That can be wonderful. But she needs to be focused. This is another thing that I've noticed that really, I just say this. I think a lot of women in that 18 to 25 year old range in our culture will pass up really good opportunities for marriage. They'll pass up good young men because they're focused on career advancement, and they don't want marriage or having kids to get in the way of that. And they expect to have all the same marriage opportunities, later on in life when they get into their 30s and whatnot. And the reality is they won't. And, there's kind of that, it's kind of a cruel joke, but, when a 35-year-old woman asks, where are all the good men? Well, they're back in their 20s when you turned them all down back then when they were interested. So again, this is one of those things that has to do with how you train boys and girls, and how you prepare them for manhood and womanhood and what their responsibilities will be. And again, everybody's, there's variations that are specific to people's situations. I get all that, but just in generalities. But one of the things with that is that, I have noticed that young people will spend years and years of study to get themselves ready for a career, and they will invest thousands upon thousands of dollars to prepare themselves for a career with with college or vocational training or what have you, all to get ready for a career. Do they invest in various ways in preparing themselves for marriage? The reality is, marriage and family life will have far more to do with your ultimate fulfillment and your happiness than whatever your career is. And yet, so often we go all in on preparing for
Right.
career, and then we do
Right.
so little to prepare for marriage, for being a husband, for being a wife. You might prepare, you might spend a great deal of effort preparing to be a, in the business world or an accountant or whatever it might be. But how much did you put into preparing to be a husband or a wife, a mother
Yeah.
or a father? And again, I think those familial roles are actually far more important, far more crucial to our happiness and our fulfillment in life than our careers. And yet we seem to be investing very little these days into preparing for those roles.
It's really good. And if you're a parent listening to this, I mean, I think what you said about androgynous parenting, I've tried to purge the word parenting from my vocabulary.
Yeah,
We've
we should
talked
talk
about
about mothering and fathering.
That's right. Mothering and fathering. Mothers and fathers are doing different things, and the work that they're doing is also very different depending on whether it's a son or a daughter
Yeah,
that
that's
you're
exactly right.
fathering, right? And so, to your point, and you're 100% true and accurate, and I think this is easy to miss, but this is true of both sons and daughters. Who you marry and the health of that marriage is going to have way is going to overshadow uh, the satisfaction and joy that comes from your career or your education so entirely that it's almost it's not even worth talking about, almost that the marriage relationship is such a massive thing. And so it comes back to, so how are you mothering or fathering that those children in preparation for that most important relationship, and aspect of their lives. And it needs to be preparation for a son, like you said. It's preparation for protection, for initiative, for discipline, for provision. It's all of those things, for leadership, risk taking, et cetera, et cetera. For a woman, it's femininity, right? It's training in femininity, training in how to love and support and be submissive to your father, in the home. What does that look like? How does that play out? It's going to be the same way with both to your father and your mother. I mean, if you've got a daughter who back chats her parents every single time she's asked to do anything, then of course she's going to carry that into her marriage, right? Of course. I mean, that's going to
Yeah,
be right.
yeah, you're exactly right. And I would add, for a daughter, and this is where having a really well-rounded education for a daughter is so important. It's developing, we might call them domestic skills, but I would say the skills that are needed to run and oversee and build a productive household,
Right.
which requires incredible ingenuity and resourcefulness. There's nothing easy about being a quote unquote homemaker. I mean, that role gets castigated today, and of course, with the rise of the Industrial Revolution, and we have so much technology in our homes now, appliances that do make a lot of the that save time and obviously make a lot of those household tasks much easier
Sure.
than they once were. But to manage a household, which would be her
Yeah.
role, when that becomes a household that is full of children and all kinds of other things, it is a very demanding task, actually.
Right.
And I think one of the great tragedies of life in modern America is that it's not done well. We have
Right.
allowed the household to be hollowed out to the point where, what happens in the typical household today? Well, it's where you sleep and it's where you watch Netflix. And that's
Mhm.
about it. And everything else has been outsourced. But I would actually say no, the Bible's got a much more compelling vision for what the household is about. I don't mean everything has to take place, within the confines of the four walls of your house. Obviously not. But I'm just saying, I mean, a household is more than that. But it really takes a lot to run and manage a household well.
Yeah.
It's a demanding vocation, and in the past that was well understood.
Right.
And the homemaker, the wife and mother who is devoted to her home, like the Proverbs 31 woman, or like Paul talks about in Titus chapter 2, where he says that women are to be homemakers. that was a highly respected role and calling because it was demanding. It required a wide range of skills. I'll make another book recommendation here. It's really a collection of essays. G.K. Chesterton's book, Brave New Family, is excellent in really showing the value, worth, and demandingness of the woman's role in the home, and how foolish women are to think, oh, if I'm going to have a fulfilling life, I've got to abandon the home and go pursue a career that's going to take me outside of the home, and I can drop my kids off at daycare on my way to work. He really makes a very compelling argument for the role of the wife and the mother as a homemaker. And I'm not going to try to recapitulate all his arguments here. I'll just point you to the book, but it's excellent.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of the stuff you're talking about also is discussed a great deal in C.R. Wiley's book, Man of the House, which made a huge impact on me, and is something I've been talking a lot about ever since I read it and reread it. But yeah, to point parents and their daughters to Proverbs 31, if you do a really thorough examination of what that woman was actually doing, this was not a woman who was lazy, for starters. I mean, that she was a very incredibly industrious woman. I made the comment. I led an event here in Huntsville a while back on family-based businesses, and one of the comments I made was, if you look at the Proverbs 31 woman, this was not a woman who had self-esteem issues. This is not a woman who had depression or anxiety. She was had a staff. She was out doing real estate deals. She was creating products and taking them to market. Again, these are the kinds of things that wise parents and wise daughters are preparing her for. That's the kind of work that they're preparing her for. And to the extent that any man, who has any degree of wisdom is going to see that and highly value that, and be looking for those kinds of characteristics as he looks for a wife, is going to see them and be attracted to them. So yeah, that's huge. Well, I think Rich, go ahead. Yeah.
Well, yeah, just I know we're getting towards the end of our time here. God, a minute always turns into 60 minutes or so. But one other thing here, really a couple things that I'll say as we move towards wrapping this up. One is I think we also need to reckon with the fact that there's a lot of cynicism about marriage in our day, and there will probably be many young men and young women, even in our churches, who say, "Oh, I don't want to get married." Maybe their parents' marriage has not been that happy, or maybe just they've absorbed this view of marriage from the culture. I think that's something that we live in a culture where most of what people are going to hear about marriage is bad news, and how marriage is confining and restrictive, and it's a form of slavery, and it's an oppressive institution, especially for women. So I would say on the feminist side, you've got this real attack on marriage, that marriage is an oppressive institution that serves the patriarchy and all of that. But I'll tell you this, on the men's side, a lot of the red pill sort of men's movement kind of stuff also makes a real argument against marriage a lot of times, basically saying marriage as it exists in the modern world today, with family law, the way family courts work and whatnot, is a really bad deal for men, and that men should not get married because, hey, if your wife just changes her mind, she can walk out the door and take half of your stuff and your kids with her, and there's nothing you can do about it because family court's going to be so slanted against you, and so men are crazy to marry. In a context where there's so much bad news about marriage, and where so few people compared to in the past, percentage-wise, are wanting to get married and aspire to marriage and all that, I would say that we need to be constantly proclaiming the good news about marriage. How marriage is, again, marriage can, if you disregard God's design for men and women, you disregard God's design for sex, marriage probably will be a disaster for you. Certainly will be a disaster for you. But if you're willing to embrace God's design and what God's word says about these things and put those things into practice, marriage is an incredible blessing It's an incredible blessing. There's nothing more glorious, nothing more hope filled, nothing more hopeful than a young man and a young woman committing the rest of their lives to one another and then setting out to build a life and build a household and really build a little kingdom, build a little
Yeah.
Christendom together. As husband and wife, that's just an absolutely glorious thing, and that's why weddings are so filled with joy and just with this really intense emotion, because it fills us with hope for the future. That's what a marriage represents. Just like when and then when a child comes into the world, that's another, sign of hope for the future as well. So it's really a glorious thing. And I don't think there's any ideal age to get married. I think it was David Brooks years ago who wrote an article that contrasted cornerstone marriages with capstone marriages. And the cornerstone marriage is really the kind of marriage like what I had, where you get married pretty young and you start out with nothing, and then you build a life together. And so you kind of go through all these phases of life together. Capstone marriage is kind of where you've done everything else. You've traveled the world, you've built a career, you've got a lot of money in the bank, and the one thing you're missing in life is a spouse. And so you get married to kind of complete that and then have kids together. But, generally that's by then you're kind of in your, say, mid to late 30s. I'm not saying that's wrong. Some people, that's how it's going to be. There are examples of this in Scripture where you've got men who get married much older later in life. It's not a moral issue here. But I think there's really something glorious about a cornerstone marriage, where Robert Capon talks about this in his book Bed and Board, where two young people get up and they promise the rest of their lives to each other, and we take them seriously.
Yeah, that's right.
We believe them when they make these promises, that they're going to hold true to these promises. But it's just a glorious thing to see that happen, and know that this is how God is going to add another link in the chain of his kingdom. The kingdom's going to keep going. Another generation is going to be born into the world and carry on that legacy of faith into the future. It's just a really glorious thing. So in a cultural environment where there's so much cynicism about marriage, let's proclaim the good news about marriage. Let's make sure our kids understand. Not every single child's going to get married, obviously, that grows up in our homes, but let's proclaim the good news about marriage, what a blessing marriage is, what a glorious institution it is. I think marriage is, it's one of the best, and this is obvious in Ephesians 5, one of the best created pictures we have of the gospel. And it's one of the best ways we can help people understand the gospel, because a husband in his marriage representing Christ, and a wife representing the church. So the husband by how he loves, displaying Christ's love, the woman by how she obeys and submits, showing what the church, how the church relates to Christ. And that's just a glorious thing too. And a culture that is confused about sex and about gender and about men and women is going to be confused about the gospel. Absolutely. Because the gospel is presented to us in Scripture in marital terms. Yeah. So if you're confused about marriage, you're going to be confused about the gospel. So we've got to set the world right. We got to set the world straight about marriage. And the best way for us to do that is by having gloriously happy marriages and households ourselves. Marriage is its own best defense, and marriage is the best defense of the gospel when we live in marriage according to God's design.
That's right. Yeah, good word, sir. And I'll second the comment that we've got to keep proclaiming the goodness of marriage. Thank God for it and teach on it often. I think people feel like it's, maybe some think it's kind of a fad or a thing to kind of spend a little bit of time thinking about and then move on. But really, we're always, this marriage, this deep mystery of marriage that Scripture tells us about, is something that we're going to spend our whole lives unraveling and understanding deeper and deeper ways. And so it's something that we shouldn't feel ashamed or feel embarrassed about the fact that our churches and our families value marriage so highly and think so much about it and care so deeply about it and teach about it all the time. That's an important. It's central to the gospel. It's central to creation.
I remember when I was in college, and I had a Christian friend, good friend, who said that he didn't know if he wanted to get married because it was just hard to imagine bringing kids into a world as messed up as it's become. And this was in the 1990s, so of course things are far worse today. And what came to my mind, and I said this to him, I said, it's interesting that in Jeremiah 29, when the Israelites were being taken off into Babylonian exile, their temple is going to be destroyed. They are going to be enslaved by a foreign power. They're going to lose everything. The wealth that they've built up, the lands that they've lived on and have bonded with. It's all going to be taken from them. But Jeremiah, in his letter to the exiles, is very specific about what they are to do. They're to build houses. They're to plant gardens in this new place, and they are to take. I'll actually read this for you because it's so good. This is Jeremiah 29. I'll start in verse 4. Thus says the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, to all the exiles whom I have sent into exile from Jerusalem to Babylon. Build houses and live in them, plant gardens and eat their produce, take wives and have sons and daughters, take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage, that they may bear sons and daughters, multiply there and do not decrease, seek the welfare of the city where I have sent you into exile, and pray to the Lord on its behalf for its welfare, for in its welfare you will find your welfare. Okay, there's a lot of ways in which we as Christians today in America in 2022 are living as exiles. We're like, it's like our land's been taken over the same way. I mean, in this case, they were carted off to Babylon. We haven't been geographically moved, obviously, but it's like we live as exiles. We have been exiled from positions of cultural influence and power. And what are we to do? Well, we're to seek the welfare of the land where the Lord has us. And how do we do that? Well, here you have it. Build houses, plant gardens, get married, get your kids married, take wives for, and here's you see the asymmetry of how sons and daughters enter marriage. Take wives for your sons and give your daughters in marriage. So sons marry, daughters are given in marriage. It says multiply there and do not decrease. So don't be afraid to get married and have kids, even in exile, even in a context where it seems like you're experiencing the Lord's chastisement and the Lord's discipline is upon you. Even then, marriage and family life, getting married and having kids and building a family, building a household, that's a good work. That's a glorious work. That's what you're to do in exile. If we as American Christians are in exile today, what should we be doing? Build a house, plant a garden, get married, have kids, get your kids married off, give your daughters in marriage, and send your sons out to find wives, and continue building the kingdom in this way. Nothing changes.
Yeah. Amen. Amen. Well, it's all done, Rich. It's, as we know, it's all done in faith, and
That's right.
and when it comes to how to train your children or how to marry them off, Proverbs talks about the way of a man with a maiden being a great mystery. At the end of the day, it requires faith. It requires some degree of letting go, some degree of admission of the fact that you as a father cannot perfectly evaluate a man, and you as a daughter, as a potential bride, cannot perfectly predict whether or not this man is going to be how he's going to carry himself lifelong. It is an act of faith. Marriage is absolutely an act of faith, and it's something that we don't do willy-nilly. We don't do without a great degree of reverence and a great degree of fear, but we do it with joy, and at the end of the day, your kids are not going to be ruined or their marriages doomed if you didn't use the word courtship, in their early days when they were first meeting, and also at the same time, you can't sprinkle a little courtship dust on, magic dust on a bad relationship, on an unwise relationship, and have it turn out right. So I think if Christians are thinking about all of these things that we've discussed today, call it what you want to call it, and I think you can expect God to be kind and to be faithful to His promises to us.
Amen.
All right, sir. Well, thank you for another wonderful conversation on the God a Minute podcast. And thank you, listeners, for joining us. We hope that this was helpful. We look forward to your feedback and thoughts and commentary. Feel free to shoot us an email or comment on our videos or wherever you're seeing this or listening to this. Rich, look forward to talking to you next week.
Sounds good. Thanks a lot, Larson. Take care.
All right. Cheers.